Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you all are well. My name is Hilary Goldstein, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here with the New York Transit Museum. This virtual presentation tonight is part of a series of online experiences that we're hosting throughout the year. Our virtual public programs include conversations, presentations, workshops, and performances hosted by the Transit Museum, and often drawing from our internal archives, collections, and exhibitions. But of course, we also get to collaborate with outside presenters and scholars, including those whose work draws from our New York transit system. And tonight we're pleased to host a very distinguished historian, Eric K. Washington, who's going to be speaking about his book, Boss of the Grips, which we are also pleased to note has just been added to the Transit Museum's online store. So I'm going to put the link in the chat so you can take a look at that. Just really quickly before we begin, I'd love to tell you a little bit about the New York Transit Museum. The museum really started as an exhibition in the 1976 bicentennial that was so popular it became a permanent museum in the 1980s. We are located in a decommissioned IND subway station in downtown Brooklyn, and we also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal. Our programs have gone largely virtual during the pandemic, but even though the museum is now open, we're continuing to host these programs online on a variety of topics and for a variety of ages. And it's a really amazing format that allows us to engage with museum and transit fans from all around the country and all around the world. So thank you for joining us this evening. So before we start our discussion, I'd love to note that if you would like closed captioning, you can click where it says live transcript, CC at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitle. If you're not seeing that particular setting on your screen, you can click the more button with 3 dots and you should be able to see it there. Again, we're going to ask everyone to keep their microphones muted, but we are hoping to have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And feel free to use the chat to ask questions, to converse with one another as you enjoy the presentation. Okay, so now I am very pleased and honored to present our presenter this evening. Eric K. Washington is an independent historian and author. His book, Boss of the Grips, The Life of James H. Williams and the Red Caps of Grand Central Terminal, won the New York Academy of History's Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History, the Guides Association of New York City's Apple Award, and received special recognition as a finalist for the Municipal Art Society's Brendan Gill Prize. His various fellowships include being an Alelia Bundles Community Scholar at Columbia University, a Leon Levy Center for Biography Fellow with the CUNY Graduate Center, and a Dora Maar House Residency in France. A board member of the Biographers International Organization, Eric spearheads the Francis Frank Rollin Fellowship, which annually awards an African-American biography in progress. And tonight we are pleased to have him present his book, Boss of the Grips. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you all for, I want to say thank you all for braving the heat, but I think everyone is cozily indoors with their respective air conditioners. So thank you for not being at the beach. The New York Transit Museum is a perfect place to revisit. I spoke here in person on March 5th of 2020. It was my last in-person talk before all of the lockdowns. So it's nice to be back even virtually. And I did a lot of my early research on the book in their archives. I want to thank you also for attending what would be James H. Williams's 144th birthday. So I'm speaking on his behalf. I'm sure he would be glad to meet and greet you all individually, but I think he feels the spirit, and his family does, who are scattered around the country in various places. So I'm going to give some background on my subject, James Williams, that traces his coinciding rise to prominence both at Grand Central Terminal and in the neighborhood of Harlem. I began my book, and for those of you who haven't seen it, it's this, with an epigram that's almost a century old from 1923 that appeared in a newspaper. And it went, "At the Grand Central is a colored man who probably knows more people than any other Negro in New York. He is Chief James H. Williams, head of the Red Caps of the station." That comment's significance to me always reminded me how considerably well-known Williams was, even though he's relatively obscure today, but also how iconic was his workforce of the Redcaps. Like the Pullman porters or sleeping car porters, many of you may be familiar with, particularly if you watch old movies. These were their African-American rail-roaming kin. The station-bound Redcaps were crucial to the Swiss watch precision of the terminal. Moreover, their, I'm just trying to manipulate my notes here. Their relegated position of servitude was inextricably woven into the beguiling experience of early 20th century American railroad travel. Just as a boilerplate, who was James H. Williams? And I'll read just a little bit from the introduction of my book, just as sort of a snapshot of who he was. Williams' life coincided with key periods in the evolving social and cultural world of African Americans living in the ever-changing metropolis of New York City. His experiences offer a window on post-Civil War America and the heady optimism of the Reconstruction era, a period that obliged the Williams family and their kind to discover strategies to sidestep financial dependency and social stigmatization in order to achieve some form of self-reliance. And we follow Williams as a race man. He was an active, if unassuming, agent of the early 20th century ideological cause of racial uplift, which strove to quell white prejudice through Black self-improvement in education, business, labor, civic interest, and the arts. That, in the 1920s, would fuel the new Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance. And we follow him through 2 world wars, whose veterans from his earlier Redcap workforce at Grand Central acquire greater resolve to surmount the racial bigotry on their home front. The first slide. On August 4th, 1878, James H. Williams was born in a tenement at 227 West 15th Street in Manhattan. It's today's Chelsea neighborhood, and it's still standing. Both his parents were from Virginia. Each was formerly enslaved, although his father is reputed to have escaped on the Underground Railroad as a child. Young Jimmy Williams grew up within the adjacent precincts of the gritty Tenderloin District's striving Black Belt, as it was called, the striving carriage trade of the fashionable Broadway District, which was underscored with sumptuous hotels such as Sturtevant House, where his father was a waiter, lively theaters, and chic flower shops, which would figure importantly to young James Williams. And the advent of the bohemian Tin Pan Alley music publishing houses that were to come. Williams never went beyond grade school, but his education was all but elementary. He graduated from grammar school number 81 at 128 West 17th Street in today's Chelsea. Increasingly in the news, colored school number 4, as it is best known, appears to be the last physical example of one of New York City's 19th century racial caste public school system. The city's Landmarks Preservation Commission is now considering it for designation as an individual cultural landmark. So that's a 1940 picture of the school. It still looks fairly identical today, and it's been sitting there on the same spot ever since 1853. If you blink, you'll just miss it while you might be shopping at Housing Works across the street. Colored school number 4 was headed by one of the city's earliest Black female school principals, who had been hired during the Civil War in 1863. The noted educator, Sarah J. Tompkins, she's in the upper left corner, later became Sarah J. Garnett after marrying Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, who was one of America's foremost Black abolitionists and orators. You might note in this highlighted section on this list of school staff is Richard Robinson, who was the music teacher for colored school number 4, as well as for colored school number 3, which was a sister school in the same network. Colored school number 3 was significant because it was where Elizabeth Jennings Graham was a teacher. This is a name you may have heard of. She's sometimes referred to as New York's 19th century Rosa Parks. When school teacher Elizabeth Jennings had sued the Third Avenue Railroad Company in 1855, her legal victory had set a precedent towards desegregating New York City's public conveyances. But this benchmark ruling was not swiftly achieved. Indeed, more than a decade had passed, marked by the Civil War, when the cause's most conspicuous champion was celebrated. In 1867, Black New Yorkers publicly presented abolitionist Peter S. Porter an ebony gold-headed cane for services in obtaining equal rights in public conveyances. And this is the figure in the center there. I've no doubt that young James Williams's close proximity to both Jennings and Porter, looming heroes of those so-called horsecar wars, bolstered his formal childhood education. Not to mention that Porter's mansion, this was Peter Porter's little hotel for Black travelers on West 26th Street, was a community pillar of James's earliest years. Also, James's early work experience imparted him with an invaluable cultural education. From adolescence into young adulthood, he was a flower messenger at Thorley's Roses. Charles F. Thorley, one of the most renowned florists of the storied Gilded Age, was also a well-known Black employer. The work exposed Williams to influential white society and political figures. It also placed him at the nexus of a Black communication network of matters both urgent and trivial. And these experiences would have primed the 24-year-old Williams for an extraordinary change. Around 1903, Williams and his wife Lucy moved their young family up to 134th Street in the neighborhood of Harlem. They were part of the first discernible wave of African Americans that anticipated the famous decades-long Great Migration soon to come. And Williams arrived in Harlem as a man of potential influence. Just his, his subtle, one second, I beg your pardon. Around 1905, Williams' apparent distinction emanated from his association with Thorley's, the flower shop, to having broken the color line at the rising new Grand Central Terminal 2 years before. It coincided with the founding of Manhattan's first Colored Elks Lodge. And this very mellow portrait of Williams belies his spirit of community activism. Just his subtle lapel pin, I don't know if you can see it, but it's the shape of a little elk's antlers. It affirmed Williams' affiliation with a controversial fraternal order that was emerging as institutional forerunners of the modern civil rights movement. As an example, so the Elks, some of you may have heard of, had started out about 1868, and it was a national fraternal organization. It was all men; women were not permitted to join, and it was white. And about 1898. The book of rules of secret rituals that they performed and practices was left by one of the officials of one of the Elks outfits, I think it was from Cincinnati, on one of the railroads. And a Pullman porter had picked it up and found it and was totally fascinated by this and immediately started organizing Elks groups that spread far and wide across the nation. So Williams was one of the early members of Manhattan's first Colored Elks group. The White Elks did not take this lightly, and they had friends in high places in politics. Notably in New York, one legislator named Bill Grattan had issued a bill that made it illegal to wear Elks insignia if you were Black. So this, although Williams is looking very, very dapper here in this picture, and you wouldn't really notice it, it's actually a key little element of his ornamentation, if you will, because it was controversial, and people were actually beaten up. And one member of his lodge, a member by the name of Ulrich Johnson, was arrested, and it went to trial, and it was drawn out. And his particular lodge had a good number of Black lawyers connected to it, and so they had their own sort of society of movers and shakers, and the court decided in their favor that since they were not permitted to join the other group of Elks, the White Elks that would not have them in, they were not committing any infraction or any offense, and it gave them permission to go ahead and wear their insignia. It didn't end there, but it was a key moment that Williams was affiliated with. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I was fascinated by how Williams's life of nearly 70 years wove through major historic eras and events of the 19th and 20th century America, springing from the American Civil War and Reconstruction era of his parents. His own life encompassed the Gilded Age, the gay 90s, World War I, the Great Migration, Prohibition, literary and artistic era known as the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression, and World War II. For 45 of his nearly 70 years, Williams was a railroad worker. He was part of the culture of public transport. He, in 1903, at 24 years old, when he was hired at Grand Central, it was part of the so-called free attendant service. And you could see on the right, there's this, it was the first graphic ad for the free attendant service, and the attendants were called red caps because of the red headgear that they wore. And it noted in the advertisements that you didn't need to, that they worked for the company. It was not necessary to tip them. And they were hired for a particular purpose in 1895 because one of the requirements was that they be bilingual at least, or multilingual. So you had about a dozen men who were hired, all white, who spoke either Spanish or German or Greek or Italian. It reflected the polyglot cosmopolis that passed through Grand Central. Another reason was that women were starting to travel on their own more often. So they acted sort of as squires, if you will. You can imagine, women stepping off of a train, coming to New York City, on a shopping trip, maybe necessarily with a baby in tow, whatever. And they would, help to carry packages and things like that. It didn't last very long. If you were white and you had language skills, you could get another job or get promoted into another department of the terminal. So 8 years in, by 1903, they hired Williams, and almost within a year, it became entirely African-American. But it was also influential because as soon as the Red Caps had been formed in 1895, every other railroad station across the country was always watching what Grand Central was doing. So they started Red Cap systems. And as soon as the Red Caps started hiring Blacks and became all Black, they started converting their Red Caps similarly. So Williams was really in a seminal position in that regard. The Red Cap service is curious. There was a legend at the time, and I came into writing the book having heard this, that one day in 1890 on Labor Day, he was spotted at Grand Central, and it was really, really crowded, and he put a red ribbon in his cap so that he could be seen, and the rest was history. And I was quickly able to debunk that because and he would have been like 12 years old, and he hadn't started working there yet. And there's a lot of documentation that says that George H. Daniels, who was sort of the publicist for Grand Central, started it in March of 1895. So that was 5 years after that rumor was supposed to have started. But you can get an idea that this red banner on the headwear was something that had already been established. So this image, this colored lithograph on the left, is a picture of an African-American man, and it says porter, and he was what was known as a public porter. So they were licensed by the city. So there was a precedent for that. But it didn't really catch on as a popular thing across the nation until Grand Central started doing it. The other thing about the system, up until, well, I mentioned this was the lowest strata in Grand Central, the lowest department, and it was the only position in the department that you could be hired in if you were African American. So, however, the color line barred Black workers from similar promotions as their white counterparts. Within the year, the force became all Black. Williams had this, sorry. My fingers are sticky. I'm trying to scroll my notes from the humidity. The next slides reveal some of the visual culture of American railroad travel at the time. So these are from advertisements, magazine covers that were prominent for decades during, this golden age of the railroads, which lasted from about, the 1900 until the 1940s. This last one here also gives you an idea of sort of another double duty that the Redcaps had, which was chiefly carrying other people's bags. But also they had the maintenance duty of rolling out the famous red carpet for the famous 20th century limited train. They didn't invent the custom of rolling out the red carpet, but Grand Central certainly did much to popularize this tradition. That carpet still exists in Grand Central's own archives. Today it's still rolled up. It's the train no longer is in service, but the carpet is at least is preserved. And you may have seen this carpet in old movies like North by Northwest by Alfred Hitchcock. So it pops up. So but this was one of their duties. So the golden age of railroad had thrust Williams into an untypical celebrity, not one from the stage or music or high society, but in the labor service occupation. Racial uplift was the urgent theme of Williams's time. And he was perhaps inspired by a sort of strategy proclaimed by Reverend W.H. Brooks, who was a prominent local leader who he knew. If we cannot move forward, let us mark time. Indeed, Williams himself took what seemed deliberate steps toward this goal of marking time when in 1909, he accepted a promotion as chief attendant, Grand Central Terminal's first and most notable African-American officer until his death in 1948. The timing was auspicious for Williams. He appeared aptly positioned for the new role, having a foot firmly planted in two of Gotham's principal enclaves that were dubbed a city within a city. Grand Central was the so-called terminal city, comprising the station's campus of shops, restaurants, galleries, offices, hotels, etc. Harlem was described as the largest Negro community in the world, a part of, and yet apart from, the general life of greater New York. Picturing Williams between his workplace and home, we can easily imagine his singular vantage point towards emerging as a leader. A particular incident soon after Williams's promotion as chief attendant in 1909 gives a sense of his strong conviction. This little news clip that you see that says Red Caps organize. On the evening of September 14th, 1909, James H. Williams summoned a throng of Red Cap station attendants from Grand Central to True Reformers Hall on West 53rd Street. Now, despite the growing exodus to Harlem, this street in what's in today's Hell's Kitchen was still a hub of Black life. The newly appointed Chief Williams had summoned them to this church on a matter of particular urgency. At Grand Central, Red Caps had been working in and around fully functional railroad service, all the while that construction crews were building up the new terminal complex around the old station. And this had started in 1903, the same year that he was hired. Not surprisingly, a fatal station accident had claimed one of Williams's men in the month before. More personally, his invalid baby daughter succumbed in the hospital a week later. Such urgencies made Red Caps acutely self-aware. They were uninsured, unsalaried, and dependent upon tips. And this predicament prompted Williams's first major demonstration of his new influential position. Chief Williams' call to action spurred his Red Cap porters to organize their own beneficial association of Grand Central Terminal. This mutual aid organization, composed exclusively of Grand Central employees, was to assist members in case of sickness, injury, or death. The men duly elected Chief Williams as president of their new mutual aid society. They also elected his assistant chief as sergeant at arms. This was Samuel Jesse Battle, who was then studying for the occupation that would thrust him into history. He would become New York City's first Black police officer. This incident from their nascent years points a telling picture to me of how James H. Williams began organizing Grand Central's station porters through then similar to the Colored Elks, mostly fraternal and grassroots-based initiatives. And it was one of a few particular ways I came to appreciate Williams's leadership. He took stewardship of his workforce's welfare through life's unscripted hardships, and he strove to sustain its morale through both rewarding and challenging times. But especially, he infused a dull job of servitude with a sense of motivational purpose. The job stakes of the time made Williams's leadership distinct from A. Philip Randolph's 1925 collective bargaining-based organization of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This is the model that inspired Willard Townsend to found the Red Caps' similar organization later in 1937, as the Great Depression drove a wave of national union movements. But in the decades-long span of Williams's tenure, we glimpse the impressive breadth of the Red Caps' impact on both Grand Central and Greater Harlem. As a New York Central Railroad employee, Williams ushered statesmen, movie stars, society elite, sports heroes, high clergy, and other notables to and from trains with marginal visibility. One writer observed Williams as a master of tactful presence. No Grand Central passenger can consider himself a big shot until Jim has personally met him. And indeed, like an emissary, he was confident to many a big shot, white and black alike. There he is with, on the right with then Mayor Jimmy Walker. And here greeting heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, arriving on the 20th Century Limited into Grand Central. But Williams was conspicuously the chief among African Americans. He was a race man who turned the gateway to the American continent into a highly coveted employment gateway towards Black middle-class life. Williams took great pride in having given New York City two of its first Black uniformed civil servants. His assistant chief, Samuel Battle, who I mentioned, broke New York's police department's color line in 1911. And then in 1919, the chief's own son, Wesley Williams, became Manhattan's first Black fireman. Out of 1,700 applicants, Wesley was not only the sole African-American applicant, but the only candidate to score 100% on the physical exam. And looking at him, you're not surprised. Years later, a newspaper would describe Wesley Williams as the man whose physique is the wonder and admiration of the whole metropolis. Wesley Williams's all-round athleticism and heroism on duty were widely reported. His subsequent promotions in 1927, 1933, and 1938 made him the city's first Black fire lieutenant, captain, and battalion chief, respectively. Wesley went on to co-found the Vulcan Society, which is still present today, a fraternal organization of New York's Black firefighters that continued to combat racial discrimination within the department for many years. Controversy around Wesley Williams's 1927 promotion to lieutenant prompted this letter you see to Catholic Archbishop Cardinal Hayes, and suggests the weight of Wesley's father, Chief Williams' influence. So it was certain that Wesley was going to be promoted to lieutenant, but with that came the rumor that after the promotion, he was going to be reassigned a desk job. Most of his service was down in Little Italy on Broome Street, where he longed to remain. And the idea that he was going to be hidden from sight was because many felt that it would be objectionable at the time to have a Black officer overseeing white firemen. So his father, who, as I've mentioned, was very influential with people in high places, wrote a letter to Cardinal Hayes, who on his many trips in and out of the city must have passed through Grand Central. And I don't know if you can make it out, but the letter is headed with Chief Williams' address as Grand Central Station. And he's asking him the Cardinal, to give some attention to Wesley's plight of wishing to stay where he was. We only have this one-sided correspondence, so We don't know what or even if Cardinal Hayes responded to Williams. We do know that Wesley Williams was not reassigned, and he remained quite conspicuously in his position at the Broome Street station, which is still there, by the way, and still an active firehouse if you happen to be walking down there for the most of his career. Chief Williams's community activism was also pretty salient. The First World War highlighted Chief Williams's exemplary leadership at Grand Central, and he reportedly went over the top in rallying his men to buy Liberty bonds during the relief efforts. But he was an especially noted lifeline in supporting the numerous redcaps in the ranks of Black troops, recalled heroically as the Harlem Hellfighters, furnishing them with sweaters, helmets, wristlets, socks, and scarves. One paper reported, Chief Williams writes to his former comrades every 10 days. Such activity made Chief Williams a logical choice to escort Needham Roberts to a patriotic evening at Carnegie Hall on November 2nd, 1918. Roberts and Henry Johnson were the two first Americans to receive France's highest military honor for extraordinary gallantry, the coveted Croix de Guerre. In his own town, Williams had long been active with the NAACP, whose leadership often acknowledged Chief Williams's formidable influence over the labor community of redcap porters. In 1929, James Weldon Johnson personally thanked Williams for his habitual fundraising diligence that had made the NAACP's most successful annual event ever. And a few years later, Johnson's successor, Walter White, found himself deferring to Chief Williams' influence by imploring Williams to give a redcap job to his dentist friend, whom an economic crash had ruined. Indeed, Chief Williams had previously had the ears of the NAACP on another matter, musical entertainment. Leaders White and W.E.B. Du Bois auditioned and approved the Grand Central Redcap Orchestra, which Williams had started in 1929, to be the NAACP's touring band. Williams had established and promoted also the Grand Central Redcap Orchestra, the Grand Central Redcap Quartet, and a choir, all of which were influential in public social life within and beyond Harlem through live, recorded, and radio broadcast performances. The musical integrity of the orchestra and quartet enabled the redcap musicians not just to be entertaining at the station, but to be artistically autonomous. They could hire themselves out. It also contributed to making Grand Central Terminal an uplifting holiday destination where New York locals and tourists enjoyed caroling for years. So just as people early on, starting in the 30s, started going to Rockefeller Center to see the tree, they would often go to Grand Central to hear the orchestra playing and the quartet singing. Also in athletics, perhaps because of his son Wesley's physical gusto, it inspired Chief Williams to strive to bridge the discrete worlds of Grand Central and Harlem through athletics. Indeed, Williams's name emerges in the annals of Negro League semi-pro baseball. In 1918, he masterfully rebuilt the Grand Central Terminal Redcap Baseball Club. He publicly challenged white executive Nat Strong, who was the most redoubtable figure in baseball bookings and playing fields at the time, for wielding unfair control of the National Association of Colored Baseball Clubs of the United States and Cuba. And during the Black Fives basketball era of the 1920s, sports writers typically opined that Williams's Red Caps basketball player team gave promise to being even better than the Renaissance Five, which was one of the most noted Harlem basketball clubs. But the Chiefs' name enjoyed its longest athletic tenure in the game of tennis. In 1931, the American Tennis Association, this is the country's oldest active historically Black athletic organization, entered an award into competition from the Grand Central Redcaps. For 3 decades, until about 1960, the eponymous Williams Cup, an $1,800 sterling silver Tiffany Cup trophy, was the top prize of the ATA's National Intercollegiate Championships. It not only exalted the compatibility of physical prowess and academic ambition, it also reflected the unconventional range of Chief Williams's influence. And in the social world, particularly in Harlem, the visibility of the Williamses among the first Black residents of the storied Strivers Row ascended and shone both as guests and as hosts. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Williams counted among the 9,000 guests who purportedly had been invited to Harlem, arts patron A'Lelia Walker's legendary $1 million wedding for her daughter. The Williams's own 5-year-old daughter, Catherine, was a flower girl. She's at the little girl at the extreme left. However, this attendance raised eyebrows at the small private wedding of the Stillmans, which was a white family in Westchester, because they had invited Williams, whom they considered a family friend. But James H. Williams was himself a renowned host. His Jimmy and his gang, being the chief and his Grand Central Redcaps, his free formal soirees at Harlem's famous Renaissance Casino or moonlight sails up the Hudson were much anticipated year-round. And in scholastics, the nature of a porter's work, New Yorker magazine writer E.B. White once observed, tends to put him in a class with beasts of burden. Yet the nature of their realized ambitions was in a class above most. Williams himself had not gone past grade school at the former colored school number 4, yet he boasted that the Redcap's scholastic record outshone any of the other Grand Central Terminal departments. It was not uncommon, paradoxically, that his Redcaps were, because they were so ubiquitous as to be taken for granted, yet so overqualified for this job as to be curiosities. A New Yorker writer counted 5 graduate students, 1 an honor student at Harvard, several lawyers, singers, teachers of music, and other persons of some erudition and attainment, staffing Sugar Hill, which was the terminal's Vanderbilt Avenue taxi entrance nickname. Another article titled "PhD Carries Your Bags" emphasized that typically 40% of Redcaps, about every 3rd man in a regiment of hundreds, had college training. Writer George Schuyler was wryly grim about this. Turn a machine gun on a crowd of Redcaps at a big railroad terminal, and you would slaughter a score or more of bachelors of arts, doctors of law, doctors of medicine, doctor of dental surgery, etc. So I'll wind up with a hypothetical guest list of Williams's 144th birthday party, if he were to be here to write invitations. So here you have just kind of a hodgepodge of notable acquaintances of James H. Williams, who he knew personally, who he corresponded with him, and would not have been unlikely to be seen if he lived so long. Some are faces that you recognize. The third one, I mentioned Cardinal Hayes. At the top there, Governor Al Smith, who was the governor of New York. That earlier photo that you saw of Williams with the bowler cap, that bowler cap was said to have been a gift of Al Smith. Governor Edward C. Smith of Vermont entertained Williams. Williams was his invited guest to his hunting lodge every year until Smith died in 1935. Further down, Mayor Jimmy Walker, who I mentioned, Bessie Bearden, who was the mother of the famous artist Romare Bearden, who was a celebrity when her son was, before he was born and while he was a little boy, as a journalist. John R. Tunis, famous sports writer. And a number of notables who did some time as Redcaps, whether it was for summer vacation or holiday vacation or for several years in. And they represented people in all aspects of social life and professional life, artists, linguists, journalists, clerics, educators, and what have you. You see at the top left, Sam Battle, I mentioned. Paul Robeson was a Redcap. Lester Granger, who was High Officer of the Urban League. Earl Brown, who was a city councilman and a noted journalist. who else who you might know? A person who I'm really intrigued by and I'm trying to learn more about, is fascinating. He was a motorcycle enthusiast, and he's at the top, at the extreme left row on the top, and he rode set off from Harlem in June of 1929 around the world on his motorcycle, and returned in 1930. Fascinating subject. So this kind of hodgepodge, this interesting hodgepodge of those people who knew Williams or who worked for Williams, make quite a, an impressive list. I probably shouldn't pick favorites, but I have a few. The motorcyclists who I mentioned, William Lone Wolf Davis, but at the left here, George Gabriel, who was from Ethiopia, and he had been hired because he was Teddy Roosevelt's interpreter and guide during a safari in 1909. And Roosevelt said, if you ever come to New York, look me up. He came to New York and he looked him up. Roosevelt tried to get him a job with the government, but he couldn't be hired because of his immigration status or whatever, even with Roosevelt's influence. But Grand Central was about to open up. This was in 1913. The only way he could be hired at Grand Central was as a red cap, but he was counted unofficially as the official Grand Central red cap, spoke 18 different languages. And the person on the right was a Broadway actor whom Williams did not want to hire, but he just happened to have a letter of recommendation from W.E.B. Du Bois, which kind of cinched it. But he became one of the most workingest Black actors on Broadway, always in supporting roles, but constantly working, but also a booking agent. So he got a lot of work for Black actors on stage as well. And he was a popular restaurant owner in Harlem. And his restaurant was sort of like Sardi's is in Midtown, was where a lot of Black actors would congregate uptown, but it also drew a lot of the Broadway crowd uptown to his place. One of his notable shows in the 1940s was starred Celeste Holm, was called Bloomer Girl. And you can see sort of recognizable illustration by a famous caricaturist, Al Hirschfeld, and his name was Richard Huey, who's the subject of my biography in research right now. So in this capacity as boss of the Grips, Williams was really part of the central nervous system of the Harlem Renaissance, that storied era, from about the end of World War I to the mid-1930s, and then of Harlem's cultural, literary, and artistic expression. It intersected, I'm drawn to ask, why does he matter today? And I think Williams matters because he's fondly likened to Grand Central as an institution of, his own word for Grand Central was as an institution of higher learning, the University of Human Nature. And one graduate journalist and politician, Earl Brown, who I pointed out, had summed it up personally. Only because the chief had a big heart and was proud of his race were hundreds of young colored men able to go through college. He embodied a unique juncture between Black and white America. His influential 45-year tenure made the monumental railroad station not only a gateway to America's greatest city, but just as much a gateway to the nation's greatest African-American neighborhood, Harlem. His determination in life embodied an expression African-Americans often use, making a way out of no way. To me, people like Chief Williams offer important lessons in personal industry and perseverance. They remind us that the responsibility of caring for our history and our heritage rests with ourselves. Williams must now, I think, be considered, along with Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jacqueline Onassis, one of the great heroes of Grand Central Terminal's storied past. Thank you again for attending this birthday celebration, and I'm happy to answer some questions that you might have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that really incredible story and legacy. We would definitely love to open this up for questions. You can type some in the chat. We already have a few already in. You can also use the reaction button and raise a hand if you would like to unmute and ask a question. I can look to a question that's already been asked.
Shall I unshare?
Sure, you can unshare.
Okay. I don't want to press any wrong buttons here.
Okay, let me
See me? Okay.
see if I can spotlight you so that you are still visible. Okay, great. So there's a question here. Did he leave behind an extensive archives? Where did you find a lot of your research?
So that's a great question. No. Figures like Williams interest me, as well as Richard Huey, who I mentioned that I'm studying now, because, well, for him, he wasn't a man of letters. I mentioned he just went to grade school, but he was written about a lot. What surprises a lot of people who've never heard of them when they read the book, they say, oh my gosh, he wasn't obscure. He was actually famous and then forgotten. And we know he's famous because I was able to find, at least if I wasn't able to find, diaries or a lot of letters that he authored, he was spoken of a lot. So he was often a part of other people's conversations. He was often the subject of other people's interviews and profiles. So that was very helpful. But it meant that I didn't find information about him in any central place. I had to go to a lot of different places and be sort of creative as to where I think I might find something about James Williams. One archive, which is not an official archive, but it was really potent for me, was I learned that his great-grandson was around and had become the repository for a lot of the family photographs. And he gave me carte blanche to use what I wanted. So I went up to his house in Connecticut with my scanner. And so a lot of the images that I was able to use were due to Charles Ford Williams, his great-grandson. And that is, as I say, it's not an official archive, but it was essential. And I was able to point out to Charles, oh, I have an article that tells me that this photo was Gertrude at this particular time, palling around with, this community or whatever. So, that's what happened. So the simple answer is no, there wasn't a single archive, but many.
Great. Joe, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hey, yeah, I had a question. First of all, this was an amazing presentation. I love your book. I'm reading it currently, and wish I could have seen you when you were at the museum in March. I think you were there right before the pandemic. But
Not for the pandemic, in spite of.
Barely made it. I'm wondering about his being the first Black red cap and how that transition happened. It may not be possible to know, but do you think that's something that they were already kind of doing? Or do you think when he became the first one, white guys were like, I don't want to do this, and so it kind of happened? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I actually addressed that in the book. My personal sense, so I don't have this in writing, is that it was not uncommon if a Black person integrated an all-white workforce for there to have been protests. We read about this all the time. I came up with no evidence of any protest, and I was kind of looking for that because I anticipated that, like, as soon as I see he's hired and he's the only one, I thought, well, I don't know if this is going to go well. I came across nothing. And then the rapidity with which it became an all-Black crew suggested something to me. But also because their predecessors, the Pullman porters who rode the rails, they had been established in the 1860s. And again, the Redcaps were the lowest echelon of public departments at Grand Central. So my sense is that it was a maneuver by the administration where we can't keep our Redcaps, our attendants here. Their skills are such that they can get other jobs. They're white, they can get other jobs, and they're disgruntled. They want other jobs. So let's just make it an all-Black crew, and that will be sort of in sync with the all-Black crew of the Pullman porters. That's my sense, because it caught on like wildfire. It just spread almost instantaneously.
Because initially they weren't porters, right? Like, I think I remember reading, they were very clear that they do not handle baggage. So I feel like they were trying to raise them up. And at first they were getting paid a salary, and it feels like it evolved to where they no longer were. And now they were reliant on tips only. Is that true? So
right. So when they were, and you saw that little advertisement, when they were started out with the first dozen white attendants, and their emphasis was that they were not porters. So they were glad to help out with something, but they didn't want you to treat them. Porter literally means to carry, a schlepper who is in New York, and they, I'm sure that inevitably happened, like, oh, can you just carry this one more box and, bat my eyes, and, I'm sure they easily and quickly became disgruntled. And I think that emphasis vanished once they made the crew all Black, because Blacks, they knew, were accustomed to having these jobs of servitude, and they did not require them to be bilingual or multilingual. So they changed the rules, and they slackened off that, that initial, they are attendants, they are not porters. They didn't dress it up as much. And you were expected to be a porter, to carry other people's bags. But you were also, what didn't change, you were still expected to be a walking encyclopedia. And that they were. And a lot of articles over the years would speak to that. Like, if you had any doubts, I think we still do this today. You go to a strange airport, or you go to somebody who's wearing a semblance of a uniform, and you ask them every question that you want to know about how to get where, because they look like they might be the person to know. And so that did not change. So you could ask them, not just directions, but where might they, wait out, a change from trains that's, going to be in another hour or so, what can they see in town? What theater is showing what that everybody is talking about, that sort of thing,
Yeah, I just think it's amazing, like, what he did with the role, and the fact that he did so much, because it doesn't require you to be such a community leader, that role necessarily, but he really stepped into that and did so much, even beyond what this role necessarily what somebody else would have done. So,
well, I think your question's great. There's a lot of levels to it. I think another part of that, though, is having come from Thorley's, I think that education that he got, that contact as an adolescent through his young adulthood, where he's meeting all of these people. He knows who's who, even if he hasn't met them. You get to a certain point where you can kind of size up who somebody represents when they walk through the door. I worked as a waiter for years, and waiters do that all the time. Like, somebody may be well dressed, but you could tell by the wristwatch they're wearing that, this is just a one night, thing. They don't live like this. So I think he was kind of seasoned for this job. He is like a diplomat in that sense, because he has an eye.
Okay, great. So I have maybe one last question that we can kind of wrap this up, which I think is a great question to do that, is someone asked if there was any memorial for Williams in Grand Central Terminal. And if not, is there any kind of effort to kind of, pay homage to his legacy?
No, there's not. And I thought that the book would do that. And anyone who wants to kibitz about that, I think there should be. There's a plaque to, Jacqueline Onassis in Grand Central. There are various ways to create some sort of a memorial, but I think there should be some recognition for the work that they did, because again, that Swiss watch precision that Grand Central was famous for could not have been attained without the Red Cap Corps. That was part of the system. There are some oblique memorials in potential. So this movement now to landmark the former Colored School number 4 would be, in a sense, a kind of memorial to him and other people, but not directly at Grand Central Terminal. And I think I'm always happy to speak to whoever would have influence over making that a reality. I think he deserves that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your research and your insight and this really incredible story. I think that was just really lovely to be able to kind of learn about this history that should have more eyes on it. And we definitely invite everyone who has come tonight to check out the book. I have, again, the listing here. It's available online in the Online Transit Museum store, which even just goes into more depth and detail than was presented here. So Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Eric K. Washington, for sharing your research and your story with us tonight.
Thank you. And if you save the chats, Hilary, I'm happy to answer some questions that you may see down the road that somebody you may want to shoot to me. If somebody is burning with a question that's
Absolutely.
the subject I like to go on about.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all
Thank you.
for joining this evening, for coming and spending your time with us at the New York Transit Museum. And reminder that we are, of course, open. We have expanded our hours starting last month. So we are open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can get your advance tickets online on our website. And if you enjoy our program, please consider making a donation, kind of allow us to keep continuing to do this work, and keep checking our website for new and upcoming programs and offerings. We're adding more options and programs as soon as we can. We'd love to see you again. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a great night.
Stay cool.
Yes.